Detective Frank Morrison had spent 32 years walking the beat in Chicago, from rookie patrol officer to decorated detective. Now, at 63, he found himself behind the counter of Morrison's hardware store in the quiet suburb of Millfield, Illinois. What should have been a peaceful retirement had become a daily reminder of how quickly the world moves past those it deems too old to matter. The morning started like any other Tuesday in October. Frank arranged the display of power tools near the front window, his weathered hands still steady, despite the arthritis that had begun to creep into his joints. The bell above the door chimed, and in walked Jake Peterson, a 20-something police officer from the local precinct, accompanied by his partner, Officer Sarah Chen. "Morning, Frank," Jake said with that particular tone young people use when they think they're being respectful to the elderly. "We're doing our community rounds. Everything quiet here in retirement land?" Frank nodded politely, but the condescension wasn't lost on him. "Quiet as always, officers. Can I help you with anything specific?" Sarah browsed the tool section while Jake leaned against the counter. "You know, Frank, my dad always talks about the old days on the force. Says it was different back then. Simpler, maybe. Less technology, less complexity." He paused, examining a wrench. "Probably easier to be a cop when all you needed was intuition and a nightstick, right?" Frank's jaw tightened slightly. "Technology is a tool, Officer Peterson, but it can't replace experience or good judgment." Jake laughed, not unkindly, but with the casual dismissiveness of youth. "Sure, but things move pretty fast these days. Split-second decisions, advanced forensics, digital tracking. It's a young person's game now." He straightened up. "Anyway, we should get going. Take care of yourself, Frank. Don't lift anything too heavy." As the officers left, Frank felt the familiar sting of irrelevance. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered this attitude since retiring. At the grocery store, cashiers spoke slowly and loudly. At the bank, tellers insisted on explaining simple procedures. Even his own daughter, Michelle, had started suggesting he consider assisted living just for the social aspect. But Frank Morrison wasn't ready to be put out to pasture. His mind was as sharp as ever, his instincts honed by 3 decades of reading people and situations. The young officers saw only an old man arranging screwdrivers and paint cans. They couldn't see the countless domestic disputes he'd diffused, the robbery suspects he'd tracked through the city's labyrinthine alleyways, or the murder cases he'd solved through careful observation and persistent investigation. The afternoon brought its usual stream of customers, contractors picking up supplies, homeowners tackling weekend projects, and the occasional teenager buying spray paint with barely concealed nervousness. Frank had learned to read them all. The contractor who paid in cash was probably skimming taxes. The homeowner buying excessive amounts of cleaning supplies might be dealing with more than just a messy garage. The teenager with the spray paint was likely planning some harmless graffiti, but deserved to be watched nonetheless. Around 3 o'clock, Mrs. Patterson from down the street hobbled in with her walker. At 85, she made Frank feel young by comparison, but she was one of the few people who still treated him like the competent professional he'd always been. "Frank, dear," she said, "I've been having trouble with young men hanging around the alley behind my house. They're not doing anything criminal that I can see, but they're there every evening around sunset. It makes me nervous." Frank listened carefully. Mrs. Patterson wasn't paranoid or prone to exaggeration. If she was concerned, there was probably a reason. "Have you called the police?" "I did." That young officer, the tall one with the attitude, came by. He looked around for 5 minutes and told me they were probably just friends hanging out. Said I shouldn't worry about young people being young people. She shook her head in frustration. As if I've never been young myself. Frank knew exactly which officer she meant. Jake Peterson had been dismissive of elderly concerns before, writing them off as the paranoid imaginings of people with too much time on their hands. "I'll keep an eye out," Frank promised. "If you see them again, give me a call." That evening, Frank drove past Mrs. Patterson's street on his way home. Sure enough, there were 3 young men in the alley, but they weren't just hanging out. They were studying the back of the houses, noting which ones had security cameras, which had clear sight lines, and which had the most valuable items visible through windows. Frank recognized the behavior immediately. These weren't friends socializing. They were conducting surveillance for future break-ins. He parked a block away and observed them for 20 minutes. They had a systematic approach, photographing certain houses with their phones and making notes. One of them even tested the strength of a fence gate. When they finally dispersed, Frank memorized their faces and the license plate of the beat-up Honda they climbed into. The next morning, Frank called the police station and asked to speak with Jake Peterson. When the young officer came on the line, Frank explained what he'd observed. "Mr. Morrison," Jake's voice carried the patient tone of someone humoring a senior citizen. "I appreciate your concern, but young people hang out in alleys all the time. Taking pictures and talking isn't illegal. Without evidence of an actual crime, there's not much we can do. Officer Peterson, I spent 32 years on the force. I know surveillance when I see it. These men were casing houses for burglary. I understand you have experience, sir, but times have changed. We can't investigate people for existing in public spaces. If Mrs. Patterson sees any actual criminal activity, she should call 911. Frank hung up, frustrated but not surprised. He'd seen this before. Young officers so focused on following procedure that they missed obvious patterns. In his day, a veteran's instincts would have been respected, even if they couldn't immediately prove wrongdoing. 2 days later, the Henderson house, 3 blocks from Mrs. Patterson, was burglarized. The thieves took electronics, jewelry, and prescription medications, entering through the back gate that Frank had seen them testing. When Mrs. Patterson called Frank to tell him about it, her voice shook with a mixture of fear and vindication. Frank drove by the Henderson house and observed the crime scene. Jake Peterson was there, taking notes and interviewing neighbors. Frank approached him cautiously. "Officer Peterson, this is exactly what I was concerned about. The men I saw casing the neighborhood, they've struck." Jake looked up from his notepad, clearly annoyed. "Mr. Morrison, I don't have time for this right now. We're conducting a professional investigation. If you have specific information about this crime, you can call the tip line. I have descriptions of the suspects and a license plate number. From 2 days ago, when you thought you saw something suspicious?" Jake shook his head. "Look, I appreciate that retirement can be boring, but playing detective isn't helping anyone. We know how to do our jobs." Frank felt heat rise in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "Officer, pride goes before a fall. Sometimes experience matters more than enthusiasm." Jake's partner, Sarah Chen, approached them. She'd been listening to the exchange and seemed more interested than her colleague. "Mr. Morrison, what exactly did you observe?" Frank described the surveillance behavior he'd witnessed, providing detailed descriptions of the 3 men and the Honda's license plate. Sarah wrote everything down, while Jake rolled his eyes. "We'll look into it," Sarah promised, though Jake's expression suggested otherwise. That evening, Frank sat in his living room, staring at the Chicago PD commendation plaques on his wall. 32 years of service, dozens of cases solved, countless lives protected. Now he couldn't even get a young officer to take his observations seriously. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe he was just an old man whose time had passed. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the hardware store. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a forensic psychologist who consulted with law enforcement agencies, entered just after Frank opened. "Detective Morrison?" she asked, recognizing him despite the years since they'd last worked together. "Just Frank now, Doc. What brings you to Millfield?" "I'm consulting on a series of residential burglaries in the area. The local police asked for my input on the suspect's behavioral patterns." She paused, studying his face. "You know, your insights on the Williams murder case were instrumental in building our psychological profile. Your ability to read crime scenes was exceptional." Frank felt a flush of pride, followed immediately by melancholy. "That was a long time ago, Doc. Things have changed." "Have they?" Dr. Warren leaned against the counter. "Human behavior doesn't change much. Criminals still make the same fundamental mistakes. They still follow predictable patterns. Experience in reading those patterns doesn't expire like a driver's license." Their conversation was interrupted by the store's bell. Mrs. Patterson entered, moving quickly despite her walker. "Frank, they're back," she said breathlessly. "The same young men. They're in the alley right now, looking at the Henderson's house and the Williams place next door." Frank grabbed his jacket. Dr. Warren, would you like to observe some criminal behavior in action? The psychologist's eyes lit up with professional interest. Lead the way. They drove to Mrs. Patterson's street, where Frank parked with a clear view of the alley. Sure enough, the same three men were there, now emboldened by their successful burglary. They were more careless this time, openly discussing which houses to target next. Dr. Warren observed them through binoculars. Classic surveillance behavior. They're definitely casing these properties. She lowered the binoculars and looked at Frank with new respect. You called this perfectly. Frank was about to respond when the situation escalated dramatically. The three men abandoned their surveillance and moved purposefully toward the back door of the Williams house. It was 3:30 in the afternoon, normally a safe time when most residents were at work or school. But Frank knew that Mrs. Williams, a nurse, worked night shifts and would be sleeping inside. They're going in now, Frank said grimly. This isn't a planned burglary anymore. They're doing a hot break-in with someone inside. Doctor? Warren reached for her phone to call 911, but Frank was already out of the car. Frank, wait! You're not a police officer anymore. But Frank was already moving, his body remembering 32 years of training. The men had forced the back door and were inside the house. He could hear muffled sounds of surprise and fear. Mrs. Williams was awake and confronting the intruders. Frank reached the back door and paused, listening. His old instincts kicked in automatically. Assess the situation, identify the threats, plan the approach. He could hear 3 distinct male voices and 1 female voice. Mrs. Williams was frightened but alive. The men were arguing about whether to flee or continue with the burglary. Just take what you can carry and let's go, one of them hissed. She's seen our faces, another replied ominously. Frank's blood ran cold. This was escalating from burglary to something much worse. Without hesitation, he stepped through the broken door. Police, nobody move. The effect was immediate and electric. 32 years of authority carried in his voice, even without a badge. The 3 young men froze, caught completely off guard by the sudden appearance of law enforcement. But Frank's advantage lasted only seconds. The largest of the 3, a muscular man in his 20s, recovered first. You're not a cop, old man. You're that hardware store guy. Frank's hand moved instinctively to where his service weapon used to be, finding only empty space. But his voice remained steady and commanding. Son, you've already committed breaking and entering. Don't compound it with assault or worse. The second burglar, nervous and jumpy, pulled out a knife. We can't let him identify us, Marcus. Mrs. Williams, a small woman in her 50s, stood frozen in her kitchen doorway. Frank positioned himself between her and the intruders, his mind racing through options. 3 armed criminals, 1 potential victim, no backup, no weapon. In his prime, with a partner and a radio, this would have been challenging. At 63 and alone, it seemed impossible. But Frank Morrison hadn't survived 3 decades in Chicago by giving up when things looked impossible. Marcus, Frank said, addressing the leader by name. That's your name, right? You've made some poor choices today, but you're still young enough to walk away from this. Right now, you're looking at burglary charges, maybe 3 to 5 years with good behavior. But if you hurt that woman or me, you're talking about assault, possibly attempted murder, 25 years to life. Marcus hesitated, clearly weighing his options. The second burglar, still holding the knife, was getting more agitated. We can't just leave, Marcus. He knows our names. I know more than your names, Frank continued calmly. I know you drive a blue Honda Civic, license plate GBN 7452. I know you've been casing this neighborhood for a week. I know you hit the Henderson house 2 days ago. The police already have all of this information. This was a bluff since Jake Peterson had dismissed his reports, but the burglars didn't know that. The third man, who had been silent until now, was clearly the youngest of the group. Marcus, maybe we should just run. This is getting too heavy. But Marcus was trapped between pride and pragmatism. He couldn't appear weak in front of his crew, but he was smart enough to recognize that Frank wasn't a typical elderly victim. You're pretty calm for someone who's about to get hurt, old man, Marcus said, trying to regain control of the situation. Frank had been in countless similar standoffs, and he knew that the next few seconds would determine whether everyone walked away alive. He needed to project confidence while giving the criminals a face-saving way to retreat. Marcus, in my 32 years as a detective, I've seen a lot of young men make decisions they couldn't take back. The smart ones, the ones who went on to have good lives, were the ones who knew when to walk away. Frank's voice carried the weight of experience and genuine concern. You strike me as smarter than your friends here. The knife-wielding burglar was getting more agitated. Stop talking to him like he's our friend. Let's just— Shut up, Danny, Marcus snapped. He was clearly the leader, but Frank could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Frank pressed his advantage. Danny, is it? Danny, you're holding a knife on a 63-year-old retired cop and a nurse who works nights to help people. Your mother raised you better than this. It was a calculated risk, appealing to whatever decency might remain in the young man. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it made them angrier. Danny's hand shook slightly, and Frank knew he'd hit a nerve. Don't talk about my mother. I bet she's proud of the man you're becoming, Frank continued quietly, coming into people's homes, threatening elderly folks, waving knives around. That's exactly what she hoped for when she raised you, right? The psychological pressure was working. Frank could see doubt creeping into all three faces, but the situation was still volatile, and he needed to end it quickly before someone panicked and made an irreversible mistake. Outside, Frank could hear Dr. Warren's voice giving directions to the 911 dispatcher. Help was coming, but probably not fast enough. Marcus made his decision. We're leaving, all of us, now. But Danny wasn't ready to retreat. We can't just— Marcus moved faster than Frank expected for someone his size. He grabbed Danny's wrist and twisted until the knife clattered to the floor. I said we're leaving. Move! The three men headed for the back door, but Frank wasn't finished with them yet. Marcus, you made the right choice today. Remember that feeling. Next time you're tempted to take a shortcut, remember that you're better than this. Marcus paused at the door and looked back. For a moment, the hardened criminal mask slipped, and Frank saw a confused young man who had let poor choices lead him down a dangerous path. You really were a cop, weren't you? Marcus asked quietly. 32 years, Frank confirmed. And I've seen a lot of young men turn their lives around when they decided to. Then they were gone, running through the alley toward their car. Frank heard the Honda's engine start and tires squeal as they fled the scene. Mrs. Williams sank into a kitchen chair, shaking with delayed reaction. Mr. Morrison, how did you— I thought they were going to— Frank sat down across from her, his own adrenaline finally catching up with him. His hands trembled slightly as the reality of what had just happened hit home. Are you hurt, Mrs. Williams? No, just scared. They woke me up and I came downstairs to see what the noise was. When I saw them in my living room— She trailed off, then looked at Frank with amazement. You made them leave without even having a weapon. How did you do that? Before Frank could answer, the house filled with the sound of sirens. Within minutes, the kitchen was crowded with police officers, paramedics, and Dr. Warren. Frank found himself giving a statement to a sergeant he didn't recognize, a middle-aged man named Rodriguez who listened with professional attention. Mr. Morrison, you're the retired detective who's been calling in reports about suspicious activity in this area, Sergeant Rodriguez asked. That's right. I've been trying to tell Officer Peterson that these men were casing houses for burglary. Rodriguez frowned. Officer Peterson didn't mention any reports from you. Dr. Warren stepped forward. Sergeant, I observed the entire incident from across the alley. Mr. Morrison's assessment of the suspect's behavior was completely accurate. His intervention prevented what could have been a violent crime. Just then, Jake Peterson and Sarah Chen arrived on the scene. Jake's face showed a mixture of embarrassment and defensiveness as he realized the situation. Frank, Jake began awkwardly. I heard you were involved in stopping this break-in. Frank looked at the young officer steadily. I tried to tell you this was coming, Jake. These men had been surveilling the neighborhood for days. I know. Jake struggled with what to say. I should have listened to your concerns more seriously. Sarah Chen stepped forward. Mr. Morrison, we ran the license plate you provided. The Honda is registered to Marcus Williams, no relation to the victim. He has 2 prior arrests for burglary. We also matched the descriptions you gave us to mugshots of his known associates. Frank felt a grim satisfaction. So they're not just three friends hanging out in alleys. Definitely not, Sergeant Rodriguez said. We've got units searching for them now, and thanks to your intervention and the information you provided, we have enough evidence for arrest warrants. Dr. Warren pulled Frank aside as the crime scene began to wind down. You know, what you did in there was remarkable. You read the psychological dynamics perfectly and diffused a potentially lethal situation. I just used what I learned in 32 years on the force, Frank replied modestly. Exactly. Experience doesn't become obsolete just because you retire. Those young officers could learn a lot from you. As the police wrapped up their investigation, Mrs. Williams approached Frank. Mr. Morrison, I can never thank you enough. When I saw those men in my house, I thought... She didn't finish the sentence. You saved my life today. Frank shook his head. I just did what needed to be done, Mrs. Williams. Anyone would have... No, she interrupted firmly. Not anyone could have done what you did. You stayed calm, you read those men correctly, and you got them to leave without anyone getting hurt. That takes special skill and experience. The next morning, Frank arrived at his hardware store to find an unexpected crowd waiting outside. Word of his intervention had spread quickly through the small community, and neighbors, customers, and even strangers had come to express their gratitude and admiration. But the most meaningful visitor was Sergeant Rodriguez, who arrived just after Frank unlocked the door. Mr. Morrison, I wanted to follow up on yesterday's incident. We arrested all three suspects this morning: Marcus Williams, Danny Kowalski, and Peter Jennings. They've confessed to the Henderson burglary and are facing charges for yesterday's break-in as well. Frank nodded with satisfaction. I'm glad you caught them. I also wanted to discuss something else, Rodriguez continued. We've had several similar incidents in neighboring communities. Young officers who don't recognize patterns that experienced detectives would spot immediately. We could use someone with your skills as a consultant. Frank raised an eyebrow. A consultant? Part-time work, helping with cold cases, training younger officers, reviewing suspicious activity reports. The pay isn't much, but we could use your expertise. Rodriguez paused. Yesterday proved that retirement doesn't mean your skills have expired. Before Frank could respond, Jake Peterson entered the store, looking uncomfortable but determined. Frank, I owe you an apology, the young officer said. I was wrong to dismiss your concerns. I let my assumptions about age and relevance cloud my judgment. Frank studied Jake's face and saw genuine remorse. We all make mistakes, Jake. The important thing is learning from them. I'd like to learn from you if you're willing to teach, Jake said. Sergeant Rodriguez told me about the consulting position. I think it would be valuable for all of us. Frank looked around his hardware store, then back at the two officers. For months, he'd felt like a relic from a bygone era, useful only for mixing paint and cutting keys. Yesterday had reminded him that experience and wisdom don't expire on a specific date. I'll consider the consulting position, Frank said finally. But I have one condition. What's that? Rodriguez asked. I want to help train younger officers to recognize that wisdom comes in many forms. Sometimes it's an elderly neighbor reporting suspicious activity. Sometimes it's a veteran's instincts about criminal behavior. Age and experience aren't weaknesses to be tolerated. They're resources to be valued. Jake nodded emphatically. I learned that lesson yesterday. I won't forget it. Dr. Warren, who had been observing the conversation from near the paint counter, approached the group. If I may add something to this discussion, she said, what Mr. Morrison demonstrated yesterday wasn't just good police work. It was masterful crisis management and psychological assessment. Those are skills that can't be taught from a textbook. Over the following weeks, Frank found himself splitting time between the hardware store and the police station. He reviewed cold cases with fresh eyes, helped train younger officers in situational awareness, and consulted on suspicious activity reports. The work reinvigorated him in ways he hadn't expected. More importantly, the relationship between Frank and the younger officers evolved. Jake Peterson became one of his most eager students, regularly seeking Frank's input on cases and community concerns. Other officers began treating Frank as a valued resource rather than a relic. 1 month after the break-in, Frank received a call from Mrs. Patterson. Frank, dear, I wanted you to know that I feel safe in my neighborhood again. Not just because those criminals are in jail, but because I know there are people like you watching out for us." Frank smiled as he hung up the phone. He looked around his hardware store, then at the part-time police consultant badge on his desk. At 63, he'd discovered that retirement didn't mean the end of usefulness. It meant the beginning of a new chapter where experience and wisdom could be applied in different ways. The bell above his door chimed, and Sarah Chen entered with a file folder. "Frank, we've got a pattern of car break-ins near the mall. The young officers think it's random vandalism, but I remember what you taught us about looking deeper. Would you take a look at the reports?" Frank opened the folder, his trained eyes immediately spotting patterns that others had missed. The break-ins weren't random at all. They were targeting specific types of vehicles with specific license plate patterns. "Sarah, these aren't vandalism. Someone's looking for cars with government plates. This could be related to identity theft or worse." As they worked through the case together, Frank reflected on how much his life had changed. The young officers who had once dismissed him as an obsolete relic now sought his counsel. The community that had seen only an elderly shopkeeper now recognized a protector and problem solver. Most importantly, Frank had learned that respect isn't automatically granted based on past achievements. It has to be earned anew in each situation, with each generation. But when it is earned, when experience is valued and wisdom is sought, everyone benefits. The story of Frank Morrison's transformation from dismissed retiree to valued consultant spread beyond Millfield. Police departments in neighboring communities began seeking his advice on community policing and officer training. Local colleges invited him to speak to criminal justice students about practical applications of law enforcement theory. But Frank's greatest satisfaction came from the small victories. Mrs. Patterson feeling safe in her home, young officers learning to value community input, and criminals like Marcus Williams discovering that someone still cared enough to see their potential for redemption. In the end, Frank Morrison learned that retirement isn't about being put out to pasture. It's about finding new ways to use the wisdom and experience you've accumulated over a lifetime. Sometimes that means stopping a robbery in seconds. Sometimes it means teaching a young officer to listen to an elderly neighbor's concerns. And sometimes it means simply showing up and proving that age is just a number when it comes to making a difference in the world. The hardware store remained Frank's primary occupation, but it was no longer a consolation prize for a forced retirement. It became a base of operations for a man who had found new purpose in bridging the gap between experience and youth, between community concerns and law enforcement response. As Frank locked up the store that evening, he reflected on the unexpected turns his life had taken. A few months ago, he'd been a forgotten veteran counting the days until irrelevance. Now he was busier than ever, valued not despite his age, but because of the wisdom it represented. The young officers had learned an important lesson about the value of experience, but Frank had learned something equally important, that respect is a two-way street, and wisdom is only valuable when it's shared with humility and offered with genuine concern for others. In stopping a robbery in seconds, Frank Morrison had done more than prevent a crime. He had reclaimed his place in a community that had too quickly written him off, and he had opened a dialogue between generations that would benefit everyone for years to come.